The decision to paint a shark mouth on the P-40 was never a matter of idle decoration. In the unforgiving skies of the Mediterranean and later over China, pilots needed every psychological and practical edge they could seize. The shark face was chosen first because it was easy to recognize. From several hundred yards away, even in the haze of battle or the glare of desert sun, the wide-open jaws and glaring eyes stood out against the drab camouflage of the aircraft. Ground crews, squadron mates, and friendly anti-aircraft gunners could instantly identify their own machines amid the chaos of swirling dogfights and low-level strafing runs. In an era when radio communication was often unreliable and visual identification remained critical, that bold silhouette reduced the risk of friendly fire and allowed pilots to form up more quickly after a scramble. Beyond simple recognition, the marking gave the squadron a unique identity. No. 112 Squadron had already earned a reputation for aggressive flying, but the shark mouth transformed them into something more than just another fighter unit. It became a badge of belonging, a visual declaration that these men flew differently, thought differently, and expected to be remembered. Other Allied squadrons soon took note. When the American Volunteer Group, later immortalized as the Flying Tigers, arrived in China, they adopted a refined version of the same design, cementing the shark mouth as a symbol of defiance against Japanese air power. The marking turned ordinary pilots into members of an elite visual club whose aircraft were instantly associated with hard-fought victories. Most importantly, the shark face was intended to intimidate enemy pilots. Japanese and German airmen who survived encounters with the painted P-40s later described the sensation of being attacked by a predator rather than a machine. The gaping jaws suggested an animal that would not break off combat, that would pursue and consume. In the psychological warfare of the air, where split-second decisions determined life or death, that image could induce hesitation, just enough hesitation for a P-40 pilot to close the range and deliver a devastating burst from his heavy machine guns. The shark mouth was therefore both a practical recognition device and a carefully calculated weapon of the mind. The precise origin of the shark mouth on Allied fighters has long been debated, but the evidence points clearly to No. 112 Squadron RAF in the spring of 1941. Operating from airfields in the Western Desert, the squadron's pilots and ground crews were already experimenting with personal markings when someone, most accounts credit a combination of squadron artists and pilots who had seen photographs of German Messerschmitt Bf 110 sporting shark-like noses, suggested painting the underside of the engine cowling to resemble the open jaws of a shark. The idea spread rapidly within the unit. Within weeks nearly every serviceable Tomahawk in 112 Squadron carried the design. When Claire Chennault's American Volunteer Group arrived in Burma and China later that year, they encountered the RAF markings through shared intelligence and photographic evidence. The AVG's own artists, notably Eric Schilling and others, refined the design into the more ferocious version that became synonymous with the Flying Tigers. Chennault himself approved the marking because it fitted his philosophy of aggressive, unexpected tactics. Thus the shark mouth traveled from the Libyan desert to the skies over the Salween River, carried not by official directive from high command but by the practical, competitive spirit of frontline airmen who understood the value of both recognition and fear. The Curtiss P-40 was never the most elegant fighter of the war, yet its structural toughness became legendary among those who flew it. The airframe was built around a robust aluminium alloy structure with a strong main spar and substantial skinning that could absorb punishment that would have torn lesser machines apart. Combat reports from both the Western Desert and the China-Burma-India theater are filled with accounts of P-40s returning to base with dozens of bullet holes, shredded control surfaces, and engines coughing from oil loss, yet still flying. Pilots regularly described landing aircraft whose wings looked like sieves or whose fuselages had been raked by 20mm cannon fire. One Flying Tiger pilot brought his machine home with more than 90 separate holes and a large section of the trailing edge missing. The aircraft was repaired and returned to combat within days. The radial engine, though not the most powerful, was remarkably tolerant of battle damage. A single cylinder could be shot away and the remaining cylinders would still produce enough power to reach friendly territory. This durability saved both pilots and scarce aircraft at a time when replacements were slow to arrive and every experienced flyer was irreplaceable. In an air war measured by attrition, the P-40's ability to absorb punishment and still bring its pilot home was a decisive advantage that no amount of theoretical performance charts could quantify. The P-40 Warhawk, the variant most closely associated with the later Flying Tigers and many RAF and Commonwealth squadrons, carried 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, 4 in the wings and 2 synchronized to fire through the propeller arc in earlier models, later all concentrated in the wings. Each gun fired a heavy 12.7 mm round at a cyclic rate of roughly 800 rounds per minute. A 2-second burst from all 6 guns delivered more than 80 rounds of high-velocity ammunition into a target, enough to shred aluminium skin, sever control cables, and ignite fuel tanks. Japanese aircraft of the period, particularly the early Zero and the various Army fighters, were lightly built and carried little armor. A well-aimed burst from a P-40's battery could tear a wing off or set an engine ablaze almost instantly. The same guns proved equally effective against ground targets. Trucks, trains, barges, and lightly armored vehicles were routinely destroyed in low-level strafing runs. The heavy bullets penetrated thin steel and wood with ease, and the volume of fire allowed pilots to rake a column of vehicles in a single pass. In the hands of a pilot who understood deflection shooting, the 6.50 caliber guns turned the P-40 into a formidable destroyer both in the air and on the ground. The P-40 was never a match for the Mitsubishi Zero in a turning fight, but it possessed one critical performance advantage that skilled pilots exploited ruthlessly: speed in a dive. The heavy airframe and robust construction allowed the aircraft to accelerate rapidly when the nose was pointed downward. Once a P-40 pilot had altitude, he could convert that height into kinetic energy, diving on an enemy formation from out of the sun or from cloud cover, firing a short, devastating burst, and then using the built-up speed to zoom climb back to altitude before the more maneuverable Japanese fighters could react. This boom and zoom tactic became the doctrinal foundation of Flying Tiger combat. Claire Chennault drilled his pilots relentlessly: never turn with a zero, always keep your speed high, attack from above, and break away downward or upward before the enemy could bring his guns to bear. The same principles were applied by RAF and Commonwealth pilots in North Africa against the more maneuverable Italian and German fighters. By refusing to engage in the classic turning dogfight that favored the enemy, P-40 pilots turned their aircraft's diving performance into a lethal weapon. Many Japanese pilots who survived encounters with the Flying Tigers later described the frustration of watching an American fighter streak past in a dive, deliver its fire, and disappear into the sky before they could even begin a pursuit. Few fighters of the Second World War were asked to operate in such a variety of extreme environments as the P-40. In the western desert it endured sandstorms that clogged air filters and abraded every moving part. In the jungles of Burma and the mountains of China it faced monsoon rains, extreme humidity, and airfields that were little more than muddy clearings. In the frozen wastes of the Eastern Front, where Soviet-flown P-40s served with distinction, it contended with temperatures that would freeze the oil of more delicate engines. Throughout these conditions the Allison V-1710 engine and the simple, rugged airframe proved remarkably dependable. Ground crews found the aircraft easier to maintain than many of its contemporaries. Spare parts were relatively straightforward, and the absence of complex superchargers or liquid-cooled systems that required constant attention meant that a determined maintenance team could keep a higher percentage of the squadron airworthy. This reliability translated directly into combat power. While more sophisticated fighters might be grounded by the lack of specialized tools or clean fuel, the P-40 continued to fly, day after day, from the most primitive strips. In a war where logistics often determined the outcome of campaigns, that dependability was worth more than a few extra miles per hour at altitude. The combat record of the Flying Tigers and of the various RAF and Commonwealth squadrons that flew the P-40 was never solely a product of the aircraft itself. It was the product of pilots who understood precisely what their machine could and could not do, and who refused to fight on the enemy's terms. Claire Chennault's American Volunteer Group entered combat with a clear tactical doctrine hammered into every pilot: use altitude, use speed, use teamwork, and never, under any circumstances, attempt to outturn a zero. They flew in mutually supporting elements, with one pilot attacking while his wingman covered. They attacked from positions of advantage and broke off before the more agile Japanese fighters could force a turning fight. They used the sun, cloud, and terrain to mask their approach. The same principles guided No. 112 Squadron in the desert and the many other units that flew the type. When pilots ignored these rules and tried to dogfight the Zero on equal terms, they paid a heavy price. When they adhered to the doctrine, they achieved kill ratios that astonished contemporary observers. The shark-mouthed P-40 became famous not because it was the best fighter in the sky, but because the men who flew it refused to let the enemy dictate the terms of battle. The bright shark mouth that made the P-40 so recognizable to friend and foe alike might have been expected to become a liability. Instead, the aircraft and the units that flew it compiled an extraordinary combat record. Between December 1941 and July 1942, the American Volunteer Group claimed nearly 300 Japanese aircraft destroyed for the loss of only a handful of pilots in air-to-air combat. Their victories protected the vital supply routes into China, disrupted Japanese air operations over Burma, and provided a rare source of good news for the Allies at a time when the war in the Pacific seemed an unbroken series of disasters. No. 112 Squadron RAF, the original Sharkmouth unit, fought with distinction throughout the North African campaign, taking a heavy toll of Axis aircraft and ground targets. P-40s flown by the United States Army Air Forces, the Royal Australian Air Force, the Soviet Air Force, and several other Allied nations contributed to victories from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of China, from the jungles of New Guinea to the frozen front lines of the Eastern Front. The very visibility of the shark mouth became part of the legend. Enemy pilots learned to fear the grinning jaws, Allied ground troops learned to cheer when they appeared overhead. The marking that made the aircraft so easy to spot also made its successes impossible to ignore, and those successes helped sustain Allied morale through some of the darkest months of the war. For all its virtues, the P-40 was never a perfect fighter, and its limitations became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. Its greatest tactical weakness was a lack of maneuverability when compared with the Mitsubishi A6M0. In a sustained turning fight at medium altitudes, the Japanese fighter could outclimb, outturn, and generally outfly the heavier American machine. Pilots who forgot this fact and tried to duel the Zero on its own terms rarely survived. High-altitude performance was another serious shortcoming. The Allison engine, lacking a two-stage supercharger in most early variants, lost power rapidly above 15,000 feet. Against later Japanese fighters and against the high-flying German aircraft of the European theater, this deficiency left P-40 pilots at a marked disadvantage. By 1943 and 1944 the type was being outclassed by newer Allied fighters, the North American P-51 Mustang with its Merlin engine and exceptional range, and the later marks of the Supermarine Spitfire that combined superior climb and turn performance with comparable firepower. Yet even these weaknesses must be placed in context. The P-40 was designed in the late 1930s as an interim fighter, never intended to remain the frontline interceptor of 1944. That it continued to serve usefully in secondary theaters, in ground attack roles, and in the hands of less well-equipped air forces long after more advanced types had appeared is a testament to the fundamental soundness of its design and to the skill of the men who flew it. The shark-mouthed Warhawk was never the fastest, nor the most agile, nor the highest-flying fighter of the Second World War. It was simply one of the toughest, most adaptable, and, when flown according to its strengths, most effective. For all its virtues, the P-40 was never a perfect fighter, and its limitations became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. Its greatest tactical weakness was a lack of maneuverability when compared with the Mitsubishi A6M0. In a sustained turning fight at medium altitudes, the Japanese fighter could outclimb, outturn, and generally outfly the heavier American machine. Pilots who forgot this fact and tried to duel the Zero on its own terms rarely survived. High-altitude performance was another serious shortcoming. The Allison engine, lacking a two-stage supercharger in most early variants, lost power rapidly above 15,000 feet. Against later Japanese fighters and against the high-flying German aircraft of the European theater, this deficiency left P-40 pilots at a marked disadvantage. By 1943 and 1944 the type was being outclassed by newer Allied fighters, the North American P-51 Mustang with its Merlin engine and exceptional range, and the later marks of the Supermarine Spitfire that combined superior climb and turn performance with comparable firepower. The grinning jaws that first appeared on the noses of No. 112 Squadron's Tomahawks in the Libyan desert ultimately flew over half the globe. They stared down Japanese pilots over the Salween, German and Italian pilots over the Mediterranean, and Soviet pilots' adversaries over the Eastern Front. They became a symbol not of technical perfection, but of determination, tactical intelligence, and the stubborn refusal of ordinary airmen to accept the limitations of the machines they were given. In the end, the shark mouth was more than paint. It was a declaration that even a fighter with clear weaknesses could, in the right hands, become a legend.